Jason had it all, a billionaire empire, a beautiful wife, and a life anyone would envy. But when his pregnant wife Emily went into labor, he refused to drive her to the hospital. Instead, he rushed to be with his mistress, Lena, who had called him in desperation. What followed was a betrayal so deep, it would change all their lives forever. Jason Kingsley's rise to success was the stuff of legend, a tale of grit, ambition, and ruthless determination. Born into a working-class family in a small, sleepy town, Jason had always been driven to escape the limitations of his environment. His parents worked hard to make ends meet, but they didn't have the resources to offer him the kind of future he envisioned. From a young age, Jason knew that he needed to carve out his own path, one that was far from the mundanity of everyday life. His academic achievements in high school set him apart. While most of his peers were more interested in sports or socializing, Jason was consumed with his studies, particularly in mathematics and technology. He devoured books, spending countless hours in the library, fascinated by the possibilities that the digital age was starting to open up. It wasn't long before he earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, a stepping stone that would eventually lead him to Silicon Valley. In college, Jason was a force to be reckoned with. He was the quiet genius, working on complex algorithms and software projects late into the night, often at the expense of socializing. His obsession with innovation paid off when, just before graduation, he launched his first startup. It was a small, risky venture, but it caught the attention of investors who were eager to back the next big thing in tech. Jason had the kind of brilliance that couldn't be ignored, and by the time he was in his late 20s, his company had taken off. The world he entered was one of high stakes, cutthroat competition, and a culture where only the strongest survived. Jason thrived in this environment. He made shrewd business moves, outsmarting competitors and leveraging his growing network of influential people. The deals he made were often controversial, but they were effective. He didn't care for ethics when it came to business. Success was the only thing that mattered, and Jason would stop at nothing to get it. But with his empire expanding, so did the void within him. Jason's personal life, which had once been so full of promise, began to unravel. His marriage to Emily, a woman he had once adored, became strained. While Jason's career soared to new heights, the cracks in his relationship deepened, and his emotional distance from Emily grew. Despite all the wealth, power, and influence he had amassed, Jason was beginning to realize that he had lost something far more valuable: the love of his wife. But in his mind, the price of success was always worth it. Emily had always been the kind of person who saw the world through a lens of kindness and optimism. Growing up in a small town, she was the type of person who believed in the goodness of others and the power of love to overcome obstacles. Her childhood was filled with family gatherings, community events, and the simple joys of a quiet life. Unlike Jason, whose world was defined by competition and ambition, Emily found her happiness in the small, everyday moments that others might overlook. She first met Jason at a charity gala in the city, a world far removed from the one she was accustomed to. Emily was volunteering at the event, serving food and talking to guests about the cause, when Jason approached her. He was a man who commanded attention with his sharp suit, confident demeanor, and effortless charm. He had a way of making people feel both captivated and intimidated, but Emily wasn't easily swayed. She listened to him talk about his business ventures, his dreams, and his desire to make a difference. Despite his success, there was something vulnerable about him, a subtle loneliness that peeked through his polished exterior. Over time, their connection grew, and despite the vast differences in their backgrounds, Emily was drawn to Jason's ambition and determination. She admired his drive, believing that his success came from a place of passion and hard work. For Jason, Emily represented something different: innocence and warmth in a world that had become cold and transactional. She was a breath of fresh air in a life that had become increasingly consumed by business and power. They married within a year, and Emily quickly adapted to the life that came with being married to a billionaire. Their luxurious home, trips around the world, and access to the finest things in life seemed like a dream come true. But as time passed, Emily began to feel the weight of the lifestyle. Jason's work consumed him more and more. He became increasingly absent, his attention always divided between meetings, phone calls, and business deals. At first, Emily brushed it off, convincing herself that his work was important, that he was doing it for their future, for their family. But as the months went by, the emotional distance between them grew. Her pregnancy brought hope and excitement, yet also a deep sense of isolation. As her body changed and her needs grew, Jason's attention seemed to drift further away. While he had been the charming, caring partner she had once adored, now he was often distant, preoccupied, and inattentive. Emily began to feel the loneliness of their marriage more acutely than ever before. Despite the wealth that surrounded her, she began to realize that money and luxury could never fill the emotional void that was slowly swallowing her life. The woman who had once seen the world as a place of endless possibility now found herself questioning whether the man she married still cared for her, or if he had ever truly cared at all. Lena Duval was a name that Jason first encountered at a business gala, one of those high-profile events where the wealthy and influential gathered to mingle, network, and show off their latest triumphs. She was striking, the kind of woman who could command a room with just a glance. Tall, with flowing blonde hair and an effortless elegance, Lena wasn't just beautiful. She was captivating in a way that made it hard for anyone to ignore her. Her reputation in the business world was as polished as her appearance. Lena was smart, ambitious, and incredibly successful in her own right. She had made her mark in the fashion industry, building a brand from scratch that had quickly become one of the most recognized names in luxury. Jason noticed her immediately, not just because of her beauty, but because of her poise and confidence. Unlike the other women at the gala, Lena wasn't interested in small talk or playing the role of the adoring socialite. She was sharp, direct, and unapologetically independent. There was something magnetic about her, something that piqued Jason's curiosity in a way that his many other business contacts never did. As the evening wore on, they found themselves in a corner of the room, discussing everything from the future of tech to the changing dynamics of the luxury market. What started as a professional conversation soon shifted into something more personal. Lena's wit and charm had a way of drawing Jason in, making him feel understood in ways he hadn't experienced in a long time. He was used to being surrounded by people who admired him for his wealth and success, but with Lena, he felt like he could talk about his real self, the one beneath the billionaire facade. There was no pretense with her, no expectation. She didn't need anything from him except the conversation. It wasn't long before their connection became more than just professional. At first it was small flirtations, an innocent touch here or a lingering glance there. But as time passed, their interactions grew more intimate. Jason's marriage to Emily, though still intact on the surface, had been strained for months, and he had been increasingly dissatisfied with the emotional distance between them. Lena offered him the excitement and validation that he had been craving. She was a refreshing break from the pressures of his life, someone who made him feel alive, someone who made him forget about the growing emptiness he had been feeling in his personal life. The affair started subtly, an occasional meeting for drinks or dinner, but soon it became clear that Jason was losing himself in the whirlwind of his connection with Lena. Her company filled a void that Emily, with her gentle spirit and overwhelming kindness, simply couldn't. And Jason, increasingly consumed by his own desires, began to prioritize Lena over everything else: his work, his marriage, and the life he had once built with Emily. He was falling for Lena, or at least the version of himself that she made him feel he could be. In her presence, he was free from the constraints of being a billionaire businessman. With Lena, he could just be Jason. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, so did the growing divide between her and Jason. What had once been a relationship based on mutual respect and affection now felt like a distant memory. The cracks that had slowly formed over the past months deepened as Jason became more and more consumed by his business and his affair with Lena. Emily, on the other hand, was physically and emotionally drained from the stress of carrying their child, all while trying to manage the weight of a marriage that seemed to be slipping further out of her grasp. It wasn't just that Jason was working late hours or attending events that didn't include her, it was the absence of his emotional presence. He would come home late, often barely acknowledging her, His eyes were always glued to his phone, texting someone, making calls, or handling deals. When Emily tried to share her concerns about the pregnancy, the strain on her body, or even just her need for his support, Jason would brush it off with a distracted, "I'll take care of it later." There was a sense of coldness about him, a detachment that felt foreign to Emily. It seemed like his world was no longer centered around her or their future as a family. Emily tried to convince herself that it was just a phase, that Jason was under pressure with work, that once their child was born, things would settle. She poured all her energy into preparing for the baby, decorating the nursery, and getting everything in order, hoping that once their son arrived, Jason would snap out of his distant haze. But as the weeks wore on, the loneliness only intensified. The nights grew longer as her contractions began to increase, signaling that the birth of their child was imminent. Yet, with each passing day, Jason seemed more unreachable. It was during one of these moments late one evening, as Emily felt the first real pangs of labor, that the realization hit her. She called Jason, her voice trembling, her contractions coming in waves. But there was no immediate answer. When he finally picked up, his response was indifferent, even dismissive. He told her to hang in there for a bit longer, that it was probably nothing to worry about. This wasn't the first time Jason had downplayed her concerns, but tonight it felt different. The urgency she felt in her body didn't seem to matter to him. His attention was elsewhere, and Emily couldn't ignore the fact that he was in that moment choosing to ignore her pain. She hung up, trying to stay calm, her heart heavy with frustration. It wasn't just that he wasn't there physically, it was the emotional void that hurt the most. Jason wasn't just absent, he had checked out of their marriage entirely. As the hours passed and the contractions became more frequent, Emily realized that she could no longer wait for him to come around. She needed to go to the hospital, but she was faced with the cold, hard truth. Jason wasn't going to be the one to help her. He wasn't going to drive her, comfort her, or even acknowledge the gravity of the situation. She was on her own. It was then that the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Jason. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, but the call was urgent. When she answered, the voice on the other end was familiar. Lena. As Emily gripped the phone, her fingers trembling, she had no idea what to expect when she answered the unfamiliar number. It was late, and she was in the middle of a whirlwind of emotions. Exhausted from hours of painful contractions, feeling utterly alone, and struggling to reconcile the husband she thought she knew with the distant figure who had barely acknowledged her during her pregnancy. But when the voice on the other end of the line spoke, Emily froze. It was Lena, Jason's mistress. Lena's voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she had no idea the chaos that was unfolding on Emily's side of the conversation. She spoke in soft tones, asking how Emily was doing, if everything was okay. It was clear that Lena wasn't calling out of concern for Emily or the baby. There was a different urgency behind her voice, one that seemed strangely detached from the situation at hand. Emily, still in the grips of labor, felt a mix of confusion and rage wash over her. She hadn't expected this call, and certainly not from Lena of all people. Her mind raced. Why was Lena calling her now? Had Jason been with her when Emily had tried to reach him earlier? The thought felt like a cruel punch in her gut. Emily could feel the distance between herself and her husband grow even wider, even though they were still in the same house, technically still married. Lena spoke about Jason, telling Emily that he had been with her earlier that evening. She had sounded somewhat frantic, and Emily could hear her voice crack as she said that Jason was supposed to be with her soon. Lena seemed to be in distress, and as she spoke, Emily realized that it wasn't just a call for an update. It was a plea for attention. She was reaching out to Emily, trying to bring some kind of clarity to the tangled situation, but it only made Emily feel more isolated and betrayed. Then, almost as if Lena hadn't noticed the storm raging within Emily, she casually dropped the bombshell. Jason had promised to meet her, to be with her tonight. He had told Lena that he would take care of things with Emily, meaning he would handle the birth of their child and get to the hospital once everything settled down. But now, Lena was frantic. Something had happened that made her urgent, call even more disturbing. It was at this moment that the truth hit Emily like a tidal wave. Jason wasn't coming. The man who should have been by her side, holding her hand as they prepared for the arrival of their child, had instead abandoned her, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. And now, on top of all of it, Lena was dragging herself into the picture, complicating an already impossible situation. The betrayal was suffocating. Before Emily could process everything, Lena's voice shifted again, but this time with a sense of finality. She needed Jason, and it seemed that Lena thought that would be all Emily needed to know. Jason was with her, and Emily wasn't the priority tonight. The words hung in the air like a dagger. Jason's absence was no longer a small, painful detail. It was a full-blown abandonment. Emily's world, which had been filled with hope for their future and their family, crumbled. She realized then that she could no longer wait for Jason to come to his senses. She had to get to the hospital on her own. The finality of that thought was sharp and painful, but also freeing in a way. As the pain of her contractions deepened, Emily knew that she would have to rely on herself. Jason, for all his wealth and promises, had chosen to be elsewhere when it mattered most. The phone call with Lena left Emily feeling a strange mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. She had never imagined that the woman Jason had been seeing behind her back would insert herself into such a personal, intimate moment. As the reality of the situation settled in, Emily's emotions shifted from shock to something much colder: resignation. There was no longer any question in her mind about where Jason's priorities lay. He had made his choice, and it wasn't her. Still, the pain of the betrayal was hard to ignore, especially in that moment of desperation. She was in active labor, her contractions growing stronger, and yet Jason was nowhere to be found. Lena, the woman who had taken up so much of Jason's attention in recent months, was now the one pulling him away, demanding his presence. And as much as it hurt, Emily had no choice but to accept that Jason wasn't coming to help her. He wasn't coming to hold her hand or reassure her that everything would be okay. He wasn't coming to guide her through the birth of their child. Despite the agony she was in, Emily tried to keep her focus. She knew she needed to get to the hospital, but there was one overwhelming obstacle in her path. Jason wasn't here to drive her. She could barely stand on her own, let alone get into a car and drive herself. She glanced at the clock, the minutes slipping away as her contractions came faster and harder. Time was running out. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on her. She needed to act now. With no other choice, Emily dialed 911. Her voice was trembling as she explained the situation to the operator, though her words felt foreign to her, like someone else was speaking. The operator quickly assured her that an ambulance was on the way, and that they would get her to the hospital as soon as possible. As she hung up, Emily sank into the couch, trying to calm her breathing, but the feeling of abandonment still gnawed at her. It was the cruelest irony. Jason, the man she had married, the father of her child, had become a ghost. He wasn't there when she needed him the most. Yet Lena was there in the background, the woman who had taken away so much of the love and attention Jason once gave her. Emily could feel the bitterness rising in her throat, but just as she was about to let herself fall apart, the sound of sirens in the distance reached her ears. The ambulance had arrived. She could hear footsteps outside. Then the doorbell rang, and moments later, paramedics rushed into the room. Their calm professionalism helped soothe her frayed nerves, and before she knew it, she was being lifted onto a stretcher. Despite the physical discomfort of the labor, Emily felt a strange sense of clarity as she was wheeled toward the ambulance. It was as though she had been given a moment of release from the suffocating hold of her husband's neglect. She wasn't alone anymore. The paramedics, strangers to her, were there for her when Jason, the person who should have been there, wasn't. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off toward the hospital, Emily looked out the window at the blur of lights passing by. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was certain. She was done waiting for Jason to choose her. She had always been there for him, supporting him through everything. Now, it was time for her to choose herself and their baby, and that was exactly what she intended to do. As the ambulance sped through the streets, Emily's thoughts raced faster than the vehicle. The rhythmic hum of the sirens, the feeling of the stretcher beneath her, and the paramedics' gentle reassurances were a strange comfort. Yet the emotional storm inside her was undeniable. Her body was consumed by the contractions, the waves of pain that grew stronger with each passing minute. But amidst it all, her mind kept returning to one thought. Jason had abandoned her. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had chosen someone else when it mattered most. The bitterness she had felt toward Lena slowly began to turn into something else. Disappointment. She didn't blame the woman for Jason's betrayal, but she couldn't help but wonder how Lena could stand by while Emily was left to face this alone. Lena had known about Emily and Jason's life, and yet she had become so entangled in it, so comfortable with taking what wasn't hers. Emily's chest tightened at the thought of their shared moments, their lies, their shared space in Jason's life. The anger she had initially felt toward the other woman had morphed into a quiet sadness. How could she ever have known that Jason, the man she had married, was capable of such cruelty? As the ambulance drove on, the reality of her situation settled in. It wasn't just Jason's abandonment that hurt. It was everything that had led up to this point. The constant distance, the long nights alone, the growing resentment that had crept into their marriage unnoticed. She had tried so hard to make it work, to keep her hopes up, to trust that things would get better once their child arrived. But now, as she lay in the ambulance, surrounded by strangers and not the man she had expected to be by her side, she realized the harsh truth. Things weren't going to get better. They couldn't. She thought back to the first time she had met Jason, the man who had seemed so full of promise. He had made her believe in something bigger than herself, in a life filled with possibility. Their love had been intoxicating in the beginning, a whirlwind of passion, success, and dreams of a future together. But that future had slowly slipped away, piece by piece. Emily had been left holding on to memories of a man who was no longer the one she had fallen in love with. And now, with their child on the way, she had to face the reality that she was about to become a mother without him by her side. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to give in to the overwhelming sadness. She wasn't weak. She wasn't going to let herself fall apart. She had a child to focus on now, a life to build. As much as Jason had hurt her, she knew that she could no longer allow him to control her emotions, her future. The bitterness was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was no longer the only thing driving her. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital, the lights flashing outside reflecting in the windows, Emily took a deep breath. She was about to give birth to their child, a child she would love and protect no matter what. The pain in her body was real, but so was the strength that surged within her. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of empowerment. She might have been abandoned by Jason, but she would never abandon herself or her baby. No matter what came next, she would be enough. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. The hospital room was sterile, the lights too bright, and the air too cold. Emily was alone. The only sounds in the room were the soft beeping of the monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses' footsteps as they moved about their duties. Yet despite the coldness of the environment, Emily felt a strange warmth beginning to grow inside her. She was no longer waiting for Jason to show up, no longer holding on to the hope that he might come through in the end. She had been forced to reckon with the truth, a painful but necessary reality. Jason wasn't going to be there for her, and she was going to be okay without him. The hours passed slowly as her labor intensified, but Emily found herself focusing more on the small, growing life inside her than the pain. Every contraction, every painful tightening of her abdomen reminded her that something beautiful was about to come into the world, something pure and filled with potential. This child, her child, was a part of her in a way no one else ever could be. There was a fierce, protective love growing in her heart, a love that had nothing to do with Jason and everything to do with the future she was about to build. Nurses came and went, administering fluids, adjusting the monitors, checking her progress. Some were kind, offering soft words of encouragement. Others were more clinical, doing their jobs without any personal touch. But Emily didn't mind. She didn't need anyone to validate her feelings or to make her feel less alone. She had made it this far on her own, and she would finish this journey the same way. Throughout the night, her contractions grew stronger, more frequent. The pain was unbearable at times, but Emily kept her focus. She had always been strong. Always been able to push through the hard moments in life, and now, this moment, this monumental shift in her life, was no different. Every breath, every agonizing contraction was a step closer to meeting her child. And yet, even as she concentrated on the rhythm of her breathing, her mind kept returning to Jason. The man who had once held her close, the man she had believed in with everything she had shattered their life together. His absence now felt like a ghost, a hollow space where love and partnership should have been. But Emily wasn't going to let his failure define her or the future she was about to create. His calls, which had started to trickle in after the birth, were distant and hollow. His apologies, his excuses, they were all the same. The truth was clear. He had chosen Lena, and Emily had no intention of making space for him in her life anymore. She wasn't angry at him anymore, though. Anger had faded into something more practical, resignation. She no longer expected anything from him, and it was freeing. As she sat in the quiet hospital room one afternoon, watching her baby sleep in her arms, Emily made a decision. She would not let the shadows of betrayal define her. She had a life to build. With each passing day, as she held her child close, fed them, changed their diapers, and cooed them to sleep, she felt more and more certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This wasn't a broken story. It was just a new beginning. Emily finally left the hospital. It wasn't with the sense of defeat she had anticipated. Instead, it was with quiet pride. She had done it, by herself. She hadn't needed Jason to help her. She hadn't needed anyone's validation or support. She was capable, and as she stepped into her car with her baby in tow, she knew she was ready to face the world as a mother. Jason, his wealth, his power, and his promises were nothing more than fleeting echoes of a past that no longer had any hold on her. The road ahead would be challenging, yes, but Emily no longer feared it. She had the one thing that mattered most: a child to love, to cherish, and to build a future with. As she drove toward the home that would now be just the two of them, Emily smiled, a sense of peace finally settling in her heart. She was more than enough, and with that truth, she knew she would thrive.